Okay, so I want to run through these questions for you for Chapter 21, Sections 1 and 2. Got some slides made up for these, this set and the next set. Don't know if I'll do them for all of them because these take me hours to make, but here we go. So in Sections 1 and 2, things we'll look at are why were Westerners so determined to colonize Southeast Asia? What was the chief goal of the Western nations? It's changing at this time period. We're looking at new classes of Africans that developed in many African nations, and what was the relationship between the Boers and the Zulu in what is today South Africa. Okay, so this is number one here, a Scottish doctor and missionary who, in his book Missionary Travels and Research in South Africa, said combining Christianity and commerce would achieve civilization for Africa. That is Dr. David Livingstone, or Livingstone if you're British. This is Africa in 1880, and you can see there are some colonies, but it's still mostly kind of a wide open continent. But if you go and look at it in 1913, with the exception of Liberia here and Ethiopia, all the rest of it is a colony of some European nation. Okay, number two, the so-called new imperialism of the 19th century sought direct control over territories, not just trading posts and missionary activities. And that is true. We are now taking direct control to have total control over these areas. And it's not just the idea of trying to make money this way, but it's seen as a extension of nationalism. This idea of having control of overseas territories is part of national pride. This is actually an example of that. This is a 1 Muhar Indian coin in 1862, British India, I should say, hence Queen Victoria being on the coin. In the 1880s, European states began a scramble for overseas territories. The extension of a nation's power over other lands is called imperialism. And again, we talk about this idea being part of one of those four things that led to World War I: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Okay. This is in 1914, showing areas that were colonies in countries and the places that they control colonies of. So, for example, France, all this area in Africa, plus Southeast Asia. The United States here still had the Philippines as well as Puerto Rico, Guam out in the Pacific. So just some ideas how those color codes line up. Number four here, European imperialism was tied to the ideas of social Darwinism, but that the fit are victorious, but it was not tied to racism, and that is absolutely false. It was definitely tied to racism. I've seen this cartoon and used it for years, and it's a really sort of damning political cartoon here because you see Uncle Sam there, the school master there, lecturing the students. The students in the back over here are the different states, and they're dutifully reading their textbooks. And supposedly the troublemakers here are all the new colonies: the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, which was a colony, but also some things they have here in terms of England, how they rule their colonies without consent. Yet we still need to do that even today, although that was the reason why we got our independence from England. Notice also the African American is still here in the classroom, but while free, he's doing work and not necessarily participating in the lesson. Our Native American is sitting over here just barely inside the door, while our Chinese or immigrant here is not even allowed in the room. So number five here, France took over the Vietnamese Empire, making it a blank, dependent on the French government for its protection. Hey, protection is a protectorate. And this blue area, which is the French Indochina at the time, is today, along here on this side, this would be Vietnam, this is Cambodia, and this is Laos. Number six here, in Southeast Asia, Great Britain formed a colony at Singapore and eventually took control of all of Burma. That is true. On the map here, you can see where Burma lies here to the east of Bangladesh and between Thailand, and then here's Laos, which is at the time was part of French Indochina. Okay, number 7 here, an exception to the takeover of Southeast Asian states was Thailand, or Siam, that became a buffer state between British and French possessions in Southeast Asia. That is also true. Again, we see from the map here, Thailand here, or Siam. And by the way, that's where we get the phrase Siamese twins. A famous pair of conjoined twins came from Thailand, what is at the time was referred to as Siam, so Siamese, and yes, also Siamese cats. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States got control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. In the Pacific, U.S. naval forces, under the command of whom, defeated the Spanish at Manila Bay, and that's Commodore George Dewey. This is sort of a map of the time period showing the greater territory after the Spanish-American War, because now we've got Alaska, Hawaii, showing in here the Philippines and some other areas, as well as parts of Samoa and Puerto Rico here. Note the spelling. He's the leader of the Philippine independence movement that led a revolt that was brutally put down by the United States, and this is Emilio Aguinaldo. It's interesting because here's Emilio here. They were fighting, and he led the resistance against Spanish imperialism, trying to get their independence. Then they actually worked with the Americans in the land fight to defeat the Spanish in the Philippines. Then it turned out that they thought they were getting their independence, but instead they just became now a colony of the United States. And brutally putting this revolt down included things like rounding people up, putting them in concentration camps, and people starving to death, which was one of the justifications we had for why we needed to free Philippines from Spain in the first place. I'll let you think on that. Number 10 here, ruling a colony through cooperation with local political elites is called indirect rule. Here's a photo showing some British in India around this time period. Notice that the two main guests or honored guests here at this thing are the British official, but also the Indian official as well. Number 11, this is when a colony is ruled by removing those local leaders and replacing them with officials from their mother country. Now, instead of having the local Indian ruler, we'd have a British ruler instead. This is that idea of moving from indirect rule to direct rule. We want to have control completely of everything, and things run exactly the way we want them run, with no concessions to local leaders. Okay. This, by the way, is Cecil Rhodes. The country of Rhodesia was named for him, showing his control over all of Africa, except for one small section, which was a German colony. Literally, the British had control from north in Egypt all the way down to South Africa. U.S. President McKinley believed it was his moral obligation to civilize other parts of the world, including the Philippines. That is true. This is McKinley. I'm going to go back to this cartoon we had before, because here we are civilizing those folks. And it's kind of funny because we're civilizing and Christianizing the people of the Philippines, who has, since they were a colony of Spain, had essentially been Catholic since the 1500s. Do the math. Number 13 here, while the early resistance movement in Southeast Asia failed, a new kind of resistance began to emerge that was based on the force of nationalism, and that is true. Now people are trying to get their independence from these countries based on the spreading of that idea that started in Europe in the French Revolution, really that idea of extreme nationalism. These folks are resisting colonization and the idea that they want to have their own independent countries. If you go back to that map of French Indochina, that becomes not just, when it gets freed, it becomes 3 countries and not just one. Okay, he's an officer in the Ottoman army who seized power and set up a separate Egyptian state. This is Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but this guy instead. And by the way, he's an Ottoman, he's Turkish, he's not actually Egyptian, but he's the guy who sets up this separate state of Egypt. Realized at the time, people were starting to see this idea of something called Pan-Arabism, and being Arabic or an Arab ethnic group was more important than actually being someone from Egypt itself. By the end of the 19th century, slavery had been abolished in all major countries of the world. This is true. I found this picture here, which I liked, and threw it in because this is in New York, and it's an abolition picture showing a woman wearing a sash here that says "abolish slavery." The other one, which you can't read, is essentially saying the same thing, just in Hebrew. So this is probably a Jewish, neighborhood or region of New York. Okay, the first British colony in Africa came about when they incorporated the west coastal states within a state. So taking the various states and then making them all combined into a single state is a process called annexation, okay, which is essentially what we did when we took Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba at the time. This is sort of that region of South Africa, and they had a small colony here. Then eventually they kind of went in all these various separate states, and now this larger gray area becomes, annexed into British South Africa. The defeat of the revolt against the British control of the Suez Canal in Egypt was one step in Egypt becoming a British protectorate in 1914. That is true. This is a painting depicting a battle in the Suez Canal, fighting and that control the revolt going on there. This is the Suez Canal here, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. And it's really vitally important for the British because they've got those territories over in India, over in Australia, and just from going from London to India, saving them over 5,000 miles in shipping. That's just think about the fuel and time involved with that. Okay, number 18 here, the British easily took control of Sudan, and the French set up colonies or protectorates in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. That is false because while the French do those things, the British do not easily take over Sudan. In fact, they experienced a couple massacres there at the time and some defeats. They eventually go in and do take control, but it's at a high cost of doing so. Let me go back there. You know what this says? The third war in the Sudan at the very bottom. Number 19, this young journalist found a famous explorer, which we talked about earlier, in Africa, and took over his work after that explorer died and helped King Leopold of Belgium set up settlements in the Congo. That explorer was David Livingstone, and so the guy who finds him is Henry Morton Stanley, which is this guy right here. And this is King Leopold of Belgium, and in the Congo they set up what becomes eventually the Belgian Congo, which became the Congo, then became Zaire, and is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Interesting thing is that Leopold is an uncle of Queen Victoria of England, because it's a long time from going on here, and she is in fact married to his son, Prince Albert. Number 20 here, the Berlin Conference met in 1884 and 1885 to settle claims in Africa and included representatives from both Europe and Africa. That is false. No Africans need to apply to determine your future. This is a drawing showing Bismarck, because of the Berlin Conference, and the various gathered European leaders simply carving up Africa like it's a cake. This also took place in other parts of the world. This is one showing China being carved up here. Queen Victoria here being represented here. This is the Kaiser of Germany, the Russian Tsar, France here, Japan colonizing a neighbor as opposed to being a colony of somebody else. And this is the Chinese person saying, "Stop, this is my country." Number 21 here, descendants of the original Dutch settlers in South Africa believed that the blank, those native to a region, peoples were inferior and put them on reservations. That's indigenous people. The descendants of the original settlers are the Boers. They speak Dutch. That sort of changed a little bit to become a language called Afrikaans. This is some fighting going on. This is the indigenous people, primarily the Zulu are an example of that, there with their fighting swords. During the Boer War in South Africa between 1899 and 1902, the British retaliated against the guerrilla resistance by burning crops and herding 120,000 Boer women and children into camps where a lack of food cost them 40,000 deaths. That is false. The numbers are actually higher than that. If you look, also, I got it on here, Andersonville, which was a Southern prisoner of war camp in the Civil War, in which tens of thousands of Northern troops starved to death because there were way more there than the camp was designed to hold. And the Southern troops couldn't afford to even feed themselves, let alone the prisoners. But it was also brought on, exacerbated by the fact that the North refused to do prisoner exchanges because they could afford to lose more people than the South could, and they didn't want to give back any Southern prisoners to let them go back to fight. This is some Boers here, the Dutch settlers in South Africa, British here with the Maxim machine gun, and a memorial to that war, the Boer Wars in Africa. By 1914, 23 here, which were the only two African states to remain independent countries? And the answer is Liberia and Ethiopia. We saw that kind of earlier. Notice all these other places are, this is French West Africa, Algeria. You can see that here, Belgian control, French control, including over here in Madagascar, German control. This is the only thing that keeps Britain from having control all the way from the north, and Egypt all the way straight down and unconnected. But everything belongs to somebody else, with the exception of Liberia, which is independent and was helped set up by the United States as a place for freed Southern slaves to go back to, although most don't, obviously, and the Empire of Ethiopia, which later on actually takes over Eritrea, which then got its independence again, I believe, in the 1990s. 24, this indigenous group battled the Boers and under their leader Shaka created an empire in the early 19th century. They were defeated by the British in the late 1800s. That's the Zulu, and Shaka Zulu was their leader. By the way, the Zulus actually inflicted the last defeat by an indigenous group on a modern army in the history of the world. The British went in a little overly confident and fell into a trap, a lot like, I guess a good comparison might be, think of Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn, kind of a trap situation. But they were using just spears and swords versus the rifles, and they managed to get control of some of the Gatling guns before they were used against them, and Maxim guns. Okay, the education of Africans in colonial schools and or Western nations led to African leaders who resented the gap between democracy in theory and its practice in colonial policy. This is true. They start creating schools, but then they also are creating people to be sort of the managers and leaders under the British head of companies or bureaucracy, bureaucratic groups in the government, but trained, especially higher ranking ones who are sent back to, say, England to study, and then coming back, we're like, wait, I learned all about all this freedom and equality things back in England, and back here, I'm not seeing it at all. And finally, we had an extra credit question, which was the Congo River is the 9th longest river in the world, second in amount of water discharged, okay, and is the deepest river in the world. How deep is it? And correct spelling, punctuation, grammar, all that good stuff. It's about 722 feet deep, which is the most commonly found source you can find. I've seen websites, because they're not really sure how deep it is, ranging anywhere from 720 to 750 to even deeper. So an amazingly deep river compared to what we think of rivers, which are, in the United States, which are generally much shallower. Okay. So there's the Congo River and its drainage system, the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see outlined there on the map as well. It's some places it's so deep and the currents are so swift and so deep that they actually have subspecies of fish and various species of fish living within literally hundreds of yards or miles of each other. And by the way, I've seen things in this. These sticks laced in here are guys who will actually swim out there and fish from there while they hold on to those and then swim back at the end of the day when they're done. That's it. So running through the questions here again. Oh, I wanted to do this. There's an old saying they used to have, which was the sun never sets on the British Empire. And what they're saying here is, the quote is, His Majesty's Dominions on which the sun never sets, by Christopher North. This is the British Empire at its height. All those things in red belong to England. In fact, this must be actually shortly after World War One, because they have now taken control of the German territories. And it is because I see Czechoslovakia up there in Europe, and so that German colony is now made part of Britain. So they have that continuous movement from north to south. But if you look from east to west, everything in red is theirs. So at some place, sometime where the British flag is flying, it's daytime. So going back here to our essential questions, why are they so determined to colonize Southeast Asia? At the time, we're just starting to get into the idea of automobiles, but using rubber, and rubber plants come from there. But also they're doing things from there in terms of there's going to be oil there found later. Spices again, but this idea of controlling things, that's one of the last places left to colonize. Their chief goal of these guys is this now in imperialism, is this idea now is that this is a sign of, nationalism and how powerful and strong you are as a country to be seen in the world, on the world stage. If you don't have overseas colonies, you're behind everybody else. In fact, that's part of why the United States actually gets in it with the Spanish-American War, but also with buying Alaska, also with taking over Hawaii. So lots of things going on there, even for us. Okay, a new class of Africans developed in many states. That's that middle class, but they're educated and trained in Western ways, and so they're the ones who become the leaders later on in the independence movement of those countries to get their independence as colonies from other countries, because they're the ones who are educated and know the ideals and natural rights that sort of belonged in the Western world. And the relationship between the Boers and the Zulu, the Boers saw them as inferiors and put them on sort of tribal lands on their own. It's when the British come in later and try to take over all of South Africa and Trinidad tribal lands that we run into that conflict later. Okay, hope you this explains some things, not just answers the questions, but also explains some things as well. I'll do 3 and 4 here a little bit and get these uploaded for you. Thanks.